Last week, the award-winning author Salman Rushdie was viciously attacked while on stage at an event in Western New York. His attacker was a 24-year-old man from New Jersey, a Muslim who traveled to Lebanon a few years ago and, according to his mother, returned to the U.S. moody and introverted, as well as more religious, and angry at her for not raising him in a strict Muslim household. Rushdie was gravely injured, requiring an airlift to a hospital where he was treated for multiple stab wounds to his neck and stomach. And as of this recording, it looks like he's going to pull through, but according to his agent, he might end up losing sight in one eye due to a puncture. This was sadly not super surprising. Rushdie has been living under the very real threat of violence since at least 1989, when Iranian leader Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa calling for any Muslim anywhere in the world to assassinate not just Rushdie, but anyone involved in the publication of his book, The Satanic Verses, which had been published just the year prior. The Ayatollah and other Muslims were offended because the book was a fictional account inspired by the Prophet Muhammad and referring to verses in the Quran about pagan goddesses. The reaction to the fatwa was so severe that in 1990, Rushdie issued a statement saying that he had actually renewed his lapsed Muslim faith and that he repudiated the actions of the characters in his book. He later admitted that that was a lie and it didn't really help anyway. So in 1991, the Japanese translator of the book was stabbed to death. The Italian translator was stabbed multiple times but lived. In 1993, the Norwegian publisher was shot 3 times but lived. And the Turkish translator was targeted by a mob of arsonists. He lived, but the mob murdered 37 other people. After about a decade in hiding, Rushdie announced around 98, 99 that he was finished hiding and that he was moving to the United States, where he resumed doing public events, including appearing on television and even in movies. I actually got to see Rushdie at the New Humanism conference in 2007, where he did a reading and then a lecture and a panel discussion on humanistic Islam. I remember being completely blown away by not just how thoughtful and intellectual he was, but how fearless he seemed to be, considering that at the time, Islamic terrorism had only become more prominent in the United States over the previous 20 years. But he did loads of events that weekend, and it would have been impossible to ensure that there wasn't an armed fanatic in his audience at some point. But I figured, I guess, after a few decades, you just decide to live your life. And, a few years later, I would experience a tiny fraction of that myself. After several years of being threatened by men, threatened with violence, it was very upsetting at first. But at some point, your brain just goes, fuck it, I gotta live my life. So it took 30 years, but an extremist finally managed to draw blood from Rushdie. Luckily, he didn't succeed in actually assassinating him, but it's still a horrific blow to free speech and to religious freedom. It's another incident that will make someone think twice in the future before they publish that novel, that cartoon, or even that tweet that is critical of Islam. And that's really fucked up. And by the way, Iran is still being a bunch of dickheads about this entire thing. Back in the late 90s, they claimed that they would rescind that fatwa, but technically a fatwa can only be reversed by the person who made it, and that asshole died from 5 heart attacks just a few months after he issued it. Some superstitious people might consider that a sign, but okay, whatever. But Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson said about the stabbing, "We do not consider anyone other than Rushdie and his supporters worthy of blame and even condemnation." Wow. Eat a bag of dicks, Iran. Anyway, all of this is horrible, but I also wanted to take a moment to talk about cancel culture and how it is obviously to blame for this attack. Yes, you see, I am a gigantic dumbass who can't tell the difference between words and physical violence. So to me, a person who makes money having smart takes online, Salman Rushdie being threatened with assassination for 30 years and then being stabbed to the brink of death is equivalent to a drink company dropping a Real Housewife as their spokesperson after she tweets that COVID-19 is God's way of thinning the herd. By the way, I got that example from a list someone made of famous cancellations where she's listed immediately after Samuel Paty, who showed college students satirical images of Muhammad and was canceled by being beheaded. All of which brings me to TERFs. Trans-exclusionary, radical feminists really never miss an opportunity to make a situation about themselves. As I've learned, thanks to situations like this one from last month when a TERF replied to my video about microscopic algae by insisting that puberty blockers are unsafe. Like, Jesus Christ, lady, get a new hobby. Kathy Young is one such person. She's a turfy libertarian with the Koch-funded Cato Institute who recently barfed this out on Twitter. Can't wait to hear from the likes of Michael Hobbs about how the Rushdie stabbing is just consequence culture and the real tragedy is the harm he caused to marginalized people. Hobbs is an investigative journalist who's been critical of the idea that cancel culture is a real problem when it comes to things like people tweeting mean things about Jordan Peterson. Hobbes' position, and the position of most reasonable progressives, I think, is that people should not be subjected to physical violence for their views, for their speech. At the same time, there are examples of speech that exist along a spectrum in which they encourage physical violence or directly contribute to violence against certain marginalized people or indirectly contribute to the continued marginalization of certain people, etc., etc. And there is an equal spectrum of reactions that people can have to those forms of speech using their own free speech, like calling for a boycott or peacefully protesting or sending mean tweets to Jordan Peterson, etc., etc. And this is all incredibly obvious when you think of the extreme examples that even have popped up in this video. That fatwa was just words. That was just speech, but those words were directly calling for violence. Iran pointing out that the fatwa was technically still in place was just words, but words that indirectly encouraged acts of violence. Protocols of the Elders of Zion are just words, but they are words that directly contribute to the continued marginalization of and violence against Jewish people. Kathy Young went on to point out that Rushdie himself was critical of writers who objected to Penn giving their 2015 Freedom of Expression Courage Award to Charlie Hebdo after that French satirical magazine was attacked by Islamic extremists who ended up murdering 12 people. She and Rushdie, it seems, likened those authors' expression of free speech to being anti-free speech and therefore pro-violence. But those authors specifically pointed out that they abhorred what was obviously a hideous crime against Charlie Hebdo on the part of Islamic extremists, and that they could defend Charlie Hebdo's right to publish even what they consider hate speech without celebrating and awarding that hate speech. Young then points out that Rushdie also signed the 2020 Harper's letter, which whined that social media mobs were restricting the free speech of people like J.K. Rowling. Michael Hobbs at the time rightly pointed out that that was a completely silly and baseless moral panic. Young wants us to believe that because we consider Salman Rushdie an intellectual and because he has been the very real victim of abhorrent censorship on the part of religious extremists and world governments, Whatever letter that he puts his name on in respect to freedom of speech must have merit. But of course, by that same measure, then, we should all agree with this letter that Salman Rushdie signed in 2009, which called for the immediate release of Roman Polanski, who had been arrested by Swiss authorities for, quote, a case of morals. The moral issue in question is that in 1978, when Polanski was 43 years old, he drugged a 13-year-old girl with alcohol and Quaaludes and then raped her as she cried, "No, stop." To avoid scarring the girl further with a long court case, authorities agreed to let Polanski plead guilty to a minor charge of engaging in unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor. After he pled guilty, he was allowed to go free before sentencing, and so he fled to Europe, hiding out in France for 30-odd years. He was caught when he tried to travel to Switzerland to receive an award for being such a great director. This, I suppose, is what qualifies as a great threat to freedom of speech for Rushdie and presumably Cathy Young. It's telling that Young and Rushdie and others who are terrified of cancel culture are the ones who are actually doing what they accuse others of, confusing free speech with violence. That Harper's letter didn't mention any specific examples of cancel culture that they objected to, but they did generally call out things like editors are fired for running controversial pieces, which was likely an allusion to the New York Times firing James Bennett after Black staff members objected to Bennett's approval of an opinion piece, which he later admitted to not having read, by Tom Cotton that called for the United States military forces to suppress Black Lives Matter protests. Should we shame those Black New York Times staffers for exercising their free speech? Did their speech cause violence to Bennett? Did Bennett's boss stab him multiple times? Or did he simply fire him? Was it or was it not his right to fire him? Is there a difference between stabbing someone and firing someone? I think so, but it seems like a lot of these free speech absolutists do not. So no, it's not somehow hypocritical to decry the use of actual violence or actual government censorship, while at the same time upholding people's right to meet speech they do not like with more speech, whether that be by expressing outrage or offense, sending mean tweets, or threatening a walkout. Trust me when I say that I know how upsetting an online mob can be when they're trying to cancel you. I had one directed at me for many years, and they were successful at getting me deplatformed from atheist and skeptic conferences. Richard Dawkins did that. They also caused me to reduce the amount of time I spend on social media, and they directly led to me seeking psychiatric help for my anxiety and depression. And I'm actually thankful for all of those things. All of those things have made me a better person. But despite those things costing me time and money and stress, all of them are on a different level from the threats of violence I've received. And even those threats are on a different level from the actual physical violence visited upon Rushdie or the staff of Charlie Hebdo or others who have been gravely wounded and murdered for their speech, for their viewpoints. I wish Rushdie the speediest of recoveries, and I hope that this heinous attack serves as a reminder that religious intolerance is unfortunately alive and well. We must continue to protect the ability of people worldwide to say what they wish without violence, especially when their speech is considered blasphemy.